I'm a Scottish nationalist, so I always like to keep an eye on what's happening in Quebec, what you're all up to under the great Anglophones. Probably won't endear me to half the audience, but there you go. Yeah, so I'm going to talk today a bit about, I'm going to start a presentation in a minute, about thinking about how we understand programming and how we understand what systems do, and in particular some of the discontents with how we document things, which is really what literate programming is about. How we understand, the old notion that a computer program is something designed to be understood by people and only accidentally executed by a computer, that it has to have a it has to have a purpose in a sense, and you need to understand it's a thing. So I'm just going to kick into my Prezzo now, if I can. Window. Okay. And you can all see that, right? So, so what is literate programming? Well, literate programming comes from. Oops. Sorry, I need to try and find. Literate programming comes from Donald Knuth's book of the same. Oh, bloody hellfire! This is annoying me. Right, so sorry, trying to get it arranged so I can see you all and also see my presentation. So literate programming comes from Donald Knuth's book of the same name. I mean, Donald Knuth famously, whilst writing his book on algorithms, took a 10-year detour to write LaTeX because he was really, really unsatisfied with the typography and layout of his book. He didn't like the look of it. And like all these things, we do these things not because they're easy, but because we think they're easy. He decided to write a program that would do high quality printing of text. And then he found it was much harder than he thought. And so he spent a lot of time thinking about, as he says here, programming is an art that should be give you a pleasure, and it's about thinking about how we present the code that we write in a way that that people can understand it, not just other people, but also ourselves, so that we can understand what we're trying to do and the purpose of what we're trying to do and think in systems. And he then tried to create a complete literate programming environment and talked about weaving and building stuff. And it kind of, it's one of these sort of slightly culty things that people think about and come back to and disappear again and go away. I have in the past worked as a typesetter. I like a well-set page. I spent a few years in Berlin with a couple of companies and came to really love black letter, which I think makes a super handsome page. This is a page from Gutenberg's original Bible. Most people in the English-speaking world look at that page and think it's the worst thing in the world. I personally think it's a thing of great beauty. So I do like. So a lot of this comes thinking how do we present our code, and what we'll see later on is using techniques of typography, of layout, of what we typically think of as front-end design, will radically change the way in which we look at the same piece of text. We tend to look at our code through the view of an editor, and what's quite interesting when you look at themes, text editor themes, they typically use muting colors for comments, light grays, and then use popping colors for keywords, structures. And so the whole typography of editors is typically to make the comments go away. And then we wonder why people don't edit their comments, they don't read their comments, the comments go out of sync. I'll quickly show you the first, I'm going to show you a little thing I wrote called literate programming, which is it's not really particularly literate. I'm trying to remember why I did this 13 years ago, or 11 years ago. Oh, sorry, 11 years ago. That would be 2013. Yeah, I know why I did this now. I had a conference coming up, and I had one presentation that I was going to do, definitely. So I had a conference talk, and then I had to have a second one in case I was organising the conference, in case I didn't get any speakers or somebody got ill or something came out and was on the program. So I had an emergency program, and I threw this together as part of that. And what I was really doing here was simply taking, in this case, Literate Erl. This is the compiler itself, written in Literate Erlang, and all I did was basically take a piece of Markdown and insert code into it, and then write a compiler that would compile that into source code, which you could then use. And did I do some fancy stuff with? Yes, I did all my test files. So really, I didn't do a huge amount. I just tried to write a compiler that would I don't even know where the code for this is. Yeah, so it's kind of like a reverse compiler, and yeah, so in Emacs it looked like this. It's just text with embedded Erlang, and the idea being that it would look better when you read it, and kind of doesn't really amount to anything. Not much for a hill of beans. But although I'm sitting here talking about an Erlang, I'm a programmer, I'm a code monkey. I've been programming since the 70s, yada yada yada. I code, constantly. I am also trade executive scum, management scum. My last proper tech job was a VPN. I had 350 engineers around the world in about 50 countries. So a lot of my other concerns are non-coding concerns. It's thinking about how we do stuff. And really, what I'm going to be talking about tonight is a very specific set of problems related to two things. One is, how do I understand what a system does, and how do I onboard people, including myself, to someone else's project, but staff to our company stuff. And the other one is, how do I stamp out multiple sources of knowledge about our code base? So if you work, I don't know how many of you worked in big companies, but typically you're going to end up with some kind of product thing in some wireframe argument. You may have a product management tool. You may have a test designing tool. You may have some documents that circulate in Google Docs. You may have wiki pages in Confluence and Jiras that raise issue, as well as Git repositories and Git issues and stuff. And trying to manage this mass is a big problem, and trying to understand things are aligned so that this piece of code reflects this decision, which is captured in this document, is a major concern. I spent a lot of time trying to eliminate tools. So if you're VPNs, getting people to stop using something is a major thing. So I started trying to move people towards, could I use documents in Git? So we originally started with a GitHub repository for architecture documents, and using Monodraw, which allows you to do ASCII art, and using plant UML. So I can start keeping things in sync. And ideally, I'd quite like a sort of rich markdown WYSIWYG front end to GitHub, so that my non-engineering staff can write documents and stuff, trying to work out a branch strategy. So some of this comes from this sort of desire to stop. Typically, people just bring in tools. You suddenly find you're using Slack, which is a nightmare. You shouldn't be using, you know what I mean? And everything stopped doing this, trying to make people stop sending emails, move on to mailing lists. So a lot of this is about thinking about that, reducing tools, and how can I do this business better. And when we look at that in Elixir terms, we then come to, if you're, from my perspective, trying to build big systems, ExDoc has its discontents. When you look at the design of ExDoc, it's very much designed to do one thing, and that is to help you use a library someone else has written that you're going to compose into your application. So it's very much designed as that sort of Ruby on Rails shop, where you get a contract to do something, you want to spin it up really quickly, you want to use generators because it's a website that looks like other websites, and you're going to need to do one this month, one next month, one the month after, because you've got staff on board and you're selling, you've got a pre-sales pipeline you're trying to fill. And how that emerges then is it emerges as documentation that looks like this. has a series of pages that tell you what the thing is, you know, has an API reference. These are the various modules. It gives you some mistasks. And then when you go to the modules, it's the usual stuff that we all expect. It's got a summary of what it does. And then it starts pulling in exported functions that you're going to use. Oh, you're not seeing the slide? Ah, right. You're right. Okay, well, I'll just show you the Literate compiler earlier. That didn't work either. Okay, bear with. I thought I'd been sharing the window, but it decided. Right. Sorry. Can't even run this thing. Okay, sorry about that. So I mean, there's nothing you haven't seen here. This is running off ExDocs. You have a you know, you have a series of plain documents. You then get the module. The module itself comes with some introductory things, some summaries, and then substantially it documents exported functions and callbacks. And when you look at how ExDoc does this, you have a set of markdown files, and you then basically do some of what Donald Knuth talked about weaving. You take your code files, you run them through your processor, and extract the documentation from the AST, and you take your markdown files and then you assemble them into a standard formatted page. But everything on this page is about how to use this library in your application. Nothing on this page is about how it works. But when you're building major systems, getting people to understand the architecture is a major problem. And so the challenge then is how do I find a documentation set that or a documentation method that lets me build documentation about the architecture, where you're and secondly, how do I make that play nice with ExDocs, because ExDocs contains a lot of great tooling. Without it, you wouldn't have the ecosystem, yada yada yada. So you know, it's not about reinventing the wheel. So a lot of this is really thinking, how do I get away from ExDoc, and how do I get a better documentation style that suits this particular architectural purpose? So not reading to understand how to use the code, but reading how to understand how to change and amend the code. And those are two very different tasks. Let's do. Now, I started thinking about this. I started doing some stuff, but really, I didn't finish it off. And then I eventually came up with a problem, which was actually not related to Elixir at all, but it kind of forced me to kick it off and get it happening and make it work and do stuff. Because I had exactly the same problem in another thing. I was doing Sonic Pi, which I don't know if you know what Sonic Pi is. It's a programming interface that lets you make music. The DSL that you program in is a Ruby DSL, so it's closely related to Ruby. A large chunk of the back end is written in Erlang, and the new version, Sonic Pi 5 Tau, you'll be programming in Luerl, which is a Lua dialect that runs on Erlang that Robert Verding's written, and the whole back end will be written in Erlang. So it's quite an interesting thing, and I was doing some music and playing about with that, and it works by calling super collider synthesizers, which have their own programming language. And I was trying to figure out how to make Sonic Pi use super collider things, and I always I don't know anything until I've written it down. So the best way to learn something is to write something about it. So I thought, right, I'm going to write a manual that will take people through this. And I want this manual to have certain properties. I want certain pages in it to appear in the manual as they are, but also I can cut and paste them in Sonic Pi and they will play. And I want other pages to appear in the manual as a good looking page, but also I can cut and paste that into SuperCollider and they will play. So I want the source code to be formatted for a publication. So I'll quickly show you the manual and then we'll look a bit at the code and then we'll talk about the compiler itself. So don't know. Right. So the manual is published as a GitHub page. So it uses Jekyll to generate it, goes to GitHub.io. This is the manual for writing Sonic Glide as the superpipe. And it's everything you expect in a manual. It just has pages. There's a PDF version, you can print it out. Dun, dun, dun. And then you just work through it. Chapter 1, what am I going to do? Da, 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 da. And then for certain pages, when I get to them, I talk about building a second synthesizer. And I'm building the synthesizer in SuperCollider. So this talks through how it's going to work. Synthesizer will accept a number of parameters, MIDI note. We define some variables. We convert the MIDI note to frequency because SuperCollider works on frequency, not notes. We generate an envelope, and then we place it create a sign oscillator and put it in a pan to do it. So really not very complicated. When we actually look at what that page looks like, oh, that's my third one, but substantially the same, isn't it? My second synthesized SuperCollider. This is actually the source code that does it. So all I've done is essentially take that source code and present it. And the way I do that is by basically embedding Markdown in the comments. The compiler understands the comment delimiters for SuperCollider. It then does a line-by-line transform of this into Markdown, and then you have the same thing. So you essentially only write the thing once, and there you go. And then I kind of stitch it together with a front page. So the front page is just a Markdown page. I think it's just a Markdown page. You said? Yeah. So the front down is just a Markdown page. And it's generated the rest from Jekyll. So the table of contents has all been pulled out from Jekyll because obviously I want to integrate other people's tooling. So that was kind of my first problem. And then I started using it I'd been doing other stuff. I'm interested in teaching people to code. And so I started writing some Gemini servers. So Gemini is quite an interesting little protocol. It's a protocol that sits somewhat above Gopher and quite a long way below HTTP, and is roughly similar to HTTP 0.9, so the sort of 1992 version of the web. The protocol of Gemini is 4,000 words long. The HTTP 0.9 was 666 words long. So it's really quite a simple protocol. And I wanted to get learners to learn code by building servers. And what's quite good about Belka is that this is the main module in it. It's only 170 lines long, and that's a full-blown Gemini server. And you can add a templating engine, you can add a routing engine, and they add up to like a couple of hundred lines each, and then you have a full-blown server that you can use and you can build. So it's like a sort of Phoenix for Gemini, but it's much, 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 much smaller. And in there, I've been building small SQL, which is a cut-down SQL server that only does select, insert, delete, and update, and join, and stores all its text in text files. So the tables are stored in text files, so that a beginner can look through the code and understand how the text is, what the tokens look like, how they're passed, how the execution AST is built, and then how it executes the read. And so I worked on this, and again, let's do. If I can do this side by side, but the key thing to note is that the manual again is the manual is what's the router? The manual pages are literally the same text, right? There's no difference at all. But what you'll notice is that simply by using, as you see here, comments here are downgraded they're pushed into gray, they're pushed into the background. We make a big effort to make this properly. Whereas on this text, the code is pushed into the background. We push that back and say, this is marked as code. You know what it is. It's separated out. And I can then read the text to figure out all the things are. So the order in which I write my code, the order in which I define my functions, I want to lay that out as a story in between the text. And so I move my, typically what you find when people write code is they just throw comments in, they throw functions in anywhere. They don't tend to have a structure to their, their module. And you hear this endless thing, oh, functions need to be short, modules need to be short. A large chunk of that is actually really because people don't choose to write and order modules in the proper order. You can write, there's nothing wrong with a long module provided it's properly structured and you can read it. And so this is a way of this Belka manual is for somebody who doesn't know how to code, who's never built a server before, who last week was literally building, the first part of the course I was doing was teaching people to write their own programming language. And the programming language, basically you build a calculator in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and then the programming language would be to execute. You typed in numbers which would generate a program, then you have to compile and execute it. So people have gone from nothing to writing that, and now I want them to write a server. So these people, the reading how it works is much, much more important than reading the code because they can't read the code. So I started building that, and I've got the router, and the router's the same thing, and yada yada yada. And so that really is kind of the path of it. And I'll quickly talk now about the actual compiler itself. Obviously, the compiler has its architecture described in itself, because of course it does. And it has exactly the same issue. It's the the pages, the representation of the source file. And like I say, it is a multi-language problem. I've written it as an E script, so it doesn't necessarily need to be. At the moment, this is I noticed today that it's slightly outdated, but it does Erlang, Elixir, Markdown, Supercollider, and Ruby. The Ruby is just Supercollider Ruby. I mean, it's exactly the same thing because the comment structure of Supercollider and Ruby is the same stuff. But in principle, there's no reason why you can't do it. Essentially, you just, once you understand the comment delimitators, you can then add the markdown that you want. And so, and it can either generate plain markdown, it can generate HTML, or it can generate markdown for Jekyll, which allows you to auto-publish on GitHub. And HTML mode is still a bit sucky because I don't use that. I just publish everything as Jekyll. And so this then, as I say, it's supposed to teach you how it works. So it starts by telling me what my actual process flow is. I have my inputs. I do my notes of spelling mistake. Of course, I do. It's traverse, not transverse. And the architecture is also misspelled. God, this is embarrassing, isn't it? Any other misspelling mistakes? Anyone who can spot a spelling mistake wins a coconut. And then it talks through all the key things that you need to understand. The key for redirection for what language you use and for what output you get is using kernel apply. So essentially, I pick up a name, and then I use that. I pick up a name by reading the file extension, and then I use that to apply the appropriate compiler. Which is what's telling me here, and the same on the output. I do that. Now, in this case, I've dumped the entire thing into my document, so I've got a complete list of stuff. But I've got a list of every module. But what's interesting about architecture, when you're trying to understand how a system works, particularly when you're in a world in which you use generators like Phoenix, so you do mix new Phoenix.server, and you're talking, is it 200 files it's generated? There's a lot of stuff, a lot of stuff in there, a lot of which is actually from what makes my system unique, just boilerplate. I really don't particularly want to understand the architecture of your application. I'm not intending to read your controllers. I look at your routing table, but I'm not interested in your controllers. I'm not interested in your HTML templates. I'm not interested in, there's a whole load of stuff I don't give a monkeys about. So when we look at the code, we'll see a couple of things in the options that the thing operates. there's a pair of matching little options that possibly seem slightly obscure, but the first option is list -l, and this just lists every file. And the reason for lighting the list option is so that you can is to use the E option, exclude. So essentially what I do with this is I run a list over the application. It gives me a list of 600. I then add that as an exclude file. And then by default, my Literate compiler is not generating anything at all. I then write a couple of markdown pages in the same way that I do those summary pages in ExDoc. I can write my additional pages that way. And then I identify, if you imagine with all these files that we have, I have a tree and a leaf problem. I'm interested in the tree, the trunk, the branches. I'm not interested in the leaves, mostly in an architecture. I want to understand what are the components that make this thing unique. And so essentially I use the exclude file to sweep away all the leaves. I just exclude all the things. So I say, look at this module, look at that module, look at that module. And I want, in my top level thing, to take you through the story of the system. We get these things in, we do this. This is the important part. This is how that works. This is how that works. Read this code. But the key thing about it is, unlike in the ExDocs doesn't have any code except for the function parameters you're invoking. That's all the code in it. You never see any internal code. It's entirely abstracted. That's not supposed to bother you, which is fine if you're consuming packages and assembling something from packages. If you're building systems, that's not acceptable. I do need to understand how your code works. I do need to understand, if you want to amend this, you need to understand my validation. You need to understand how I do stuff. You need to understand all sorts of stuff. I've just realized that you're also seeing here another pet obsession of mine that I don't know how I'm going to get there, but I'm completely obsessed with vertical alignment so that you can read case functions like this and compare one line to another line trivially. And every time I do this, linters absolutely smash it up. And God, I would love to have a linter that actually thought about and respected vertical alignment for elements to make them readable. Because again, a lot of the things that we're told, oh, you can't have a function with 200 function heads. You actually can if they're readable. If they're not readable, you can't. There's a scrambled mass and you can't compare line 16 with line 42. You're snookered. But if you can actually compare them beautifully, they work very well. So that substantially is a. There's a little thing. The other right. I mean, this is from Belka. Actually, I should have used the example from Literate Code Reader about this vertical alignment. This is an example from Belka of a piece of code that just does matching on two paths. It's matching a path against essentially it's a routing table, and I get a path that comes in. Yes, Cleve, that's the problem. It always gets totally mashed by the bloody linters. Here I have one list which is a path and one list which is a set of routes, and I match segment by segment, and then see if I've got a match to have an executable route. Yeah, developers are also fellow developers with their own Ponzi style. The other thing is one thing that, maybe we should just, maybe it's just a VS Code extension that takes a file that has markdown inside comment codes and makes it and presents it in the readable format. Maybe that's good enough. I suspect it isn't, because I'm not really interested in telling the story of a file. I do want to have a thing that is the story of a complete system. And I appreciate I probably sound like a very old man now, but the other big advantage is you can print out a manual, and then you can read the manual in a non-glottic fashion. So I can have 20 pages on my thing, And when I get to something on page 16, I go, I understand, flick, 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 flick. And I can write little notes on page 7 where it says, we're going to do this because we have this problem, and that problem will be solved in this module. And when I tell you the story, we'll get there and you can understand. And so trying to get to that stage of having the ability to build a syncretic sense of what the system does, which is actually one of the most hardest things to get. I mean, all of us will have worked on projects where a team with a strong shared architectural sense built a system, then new developers came and hacked the fuck out of it. I should have said that's on YouTube. Anyway, it's got me swear all the time in professional settings, so fuck it. Yeah, so a lot of it is thinking about that. How do you maintain system coherence and integrity when you're growing, when you're adding developers, when you're losing developers, when you're changing things? How do you maintain systemic integrity? Because, I mean, Jira is a perfect example. You use Jira, and on some pages you update a field and it updates in the background, and on other pages you have to press save. And on some pages it does like 2 behaviors in a single on a single page in 2 different panels. So that kind of loss of integrity, which makes software really, really bad, is kind of the meta problem I'm trying to solve. At the same time as I was thinking about how to maintain playing well with other libraries, playing well with tooling, not being intrusive, not being over opinionated, and being quite easy to do. Oh yeah, there's one other thing I should have said. Because my what about this? Because I have different requirements, I've got this T argument here. Because ExDoc has embedded in Elixir requirement to describe certain things, I have the ability, depending on the language and how it. So in Elixir, you have module comments, you have function comments, and you have normal comments. And in Erlang, that was traditionally now, which way around was it? Was it one percentage sign was a module level comment, 2 was a function level, and 3 was a general? The other way around was it 3, 2, 1? So Erlang had a convention in the very old days before the Elixir world started moving things, of specifying which sort of comment it had by the number of percentage signs you had, and other languages have the same thing. And I've also noticed another spelling mistake, suppress, bloody alpha. This also has the ability in generating your architecture documents to hide stuff that you don't want to see. You can just say, actually, don't give me the module doc, because that's the module doc may be a message to a user of a library, and I don't want that in my manual because that doesn't tell me anything about how the thing works. So I can do that degree of suppression by setting the type thing. And that's really it. I'm on Blue Sky. You can email me. I'm looking for work. Ask me anything. Yeah, so when I said it's about literate computing and other stuff, it's mostly about building sustainable teams and software that lasts longer than 20 seconds and has a good shelf life.
And that is very hard. In my experience. All right. First of all, thank you. I know when it's remote, it's hard to get a round of applause, but I appreciated the talk, and I've seen some thumbs up while you were talking. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. That's actually a cool feature. It's animations. So thank you very much, Gordon, for all of that. We have time for questions if anyone wants to ask something.
Yes. Thank you for the presentation first. I was wondering what solution or problem do you find to maintain it over time to make sure that if new developer come in, it doesn't degrade it or over time?
Yeah, now the thing I always say to my engineers when I'm talking about careers, particularly, it's not just engineers actually, I say it in government talk, we're talking about how we develop skills. The thing that is most determinant of what you learn is not training, it's not conferences, it's not anything else. It's the work that's allocated by your manager. So the most important factor for maintaining software coherence is a management team who understand that the allocation and rotating of staff, the work they're given, how teams are composed, decomposed and recomposed, how people are paired up with mentors, how learning happens within the team. Those are all the most important things for maintaining software coherence. It's certainly not tools. At scale, my old boss used to say this, at scale, all software problems are human problems. So if you do not have an onboarding process, you do not have architecture documentation, you do not have a culture of how we build things, you do not inculcate that to new developers, they will butcher your code. Now, when I say they will butcher your code, if you take me on as an individual contributor and you don't have any of those things, I will butcher your code, not because I'm a bad person, but because code is it's intangible. It's essentially, it's the old joke about three blind men are asked to describe an elephant. One says a hose pipe, one says it's a, depending on which part they've got is the part they can describe. When you look at a big code base, 1 million line code base, 2 million line code bases, you can only see the bit that's in front of you. And without somebody explaining to you how the bit that you're doing works, what the style is, how you code, you're going nowhere. Does that make sense, Ricardo?
Yes, thanks.
Was it you that said you do vertical alignment cleaver, or you tried?
Yeah, that used to be a thing, not to the degree that you do, like with function parameters or anything like that. But when I had like a big block of assignments or declarations where I'm setting a bunch of variables, I used to do that. But I finally just kind of acquiesced to the universe, which wants to format the code by machine. So that kind of that also takes a cognitive load off for me. So I just try to get used to the way that the official code format or whatever it might be, whatever language does for me, and I think I'm okay with that these days.
I can show you some of my extreme vertical if you like. This is, but this is me writing my own programming language, so you can all get debuggery. Well, it's written in Erlang, but what am I doing? Can you all see that? Yeah. I mean, I will do. So this is an APL for the beam, and I'm doing AST operations on records, and I will do, making really clear how my case is selecting, right? Vertical alignment makes that trivial. See, there's two and alsos, all that stuff I'll do absolutely ruthless. And I show this to people and they just start crying. Why are you doing that? Because anyway. This.
I'm the other one. I've found that if I'm doing a project by myself, then everything is very much vertically aligned, and I love it because you can just basically scan and understand the code instead of having to read from left to right. But when I'm working with other people, obviously everyone has their own programming style, and when I'm leading a team, I feel like sometimes it's too much to kind of enforce that as a programming standard, because it is so difficult for, I guess, other people to get behind, or it seems to take an extra I don't know, maybe another way, another type of thinking about code to kind of get behind it.
Yeah, I mean, I always find that you basically do two readings in code. You do an L where you come down and then say, where does this go? Or you say, where does this come from? How did I get here? And that vertical code is really good for doing that scanning. But yeah, I appreciate this stuff. Anyway, Leo.
You've talked about a lot of issues related to kind of interacting with the code, and new people interact in different ways and disturb it in even other different ways. I was wondering if you're aware of any UI or UX type research into, ways of doing it that make sense or that work better than other ways. I mean, you've talked about some very practical ways of dealing with onboarding, for example, but I was wondering if anyone has done a more systematic study related to UI and UX.
My UI and UX of reading, I'm afraid, is very amateur, but as you can see, I just read a lot of shit ton of stuff. I spent a lot of time reading. I don't have any. I mean, I'm not a front end person. I don't have a design background, so all that kind of stuff is. But it does really annoy me that we have great front end designers and we don't apply them to our own tools. And so, I mean, I understand why code is written in monospace, and I understand the beauty of writing on a grid pattern. I mean, you can do this vertical line without grid patterns, but I don't think anyone's actually sat down and thought this through. And I would love to see someone do that. I'd love to see designers go and start working. You know, I'd love to see VS Code or Atom or whatever hire a front end designer and tell them, I want you to, because it should be possible to do this. You should be able to make this page pop. You should be able to just click a button and it will go from read the code to read the comments. Bum 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 bum. You know, it's not rocket science what I've done with this, right? It's just really primitive typography. But no, I don't have any science behind it. Just
yeah, I kind of interpret the design community as having abdicated their responsibility for dealing with software development in general. And so, you know, they haven't only not done a good job, they haven't done any job at all. So yes, we're all waiting for the people who know something about human cognition to come in and say something clever.
Yeah, but this is always true. I mean, we see this. It's a systematic problem with open source projects where the customer is also a developer tend to be pretty good. Open source project where the customer is somebody who isn't a developer, who isn't the developer who's writing it, are bloody awful. And I'm old enough. I don't know. I'm probably going to get run out of town on a rail here. I don't know. Has anyone ever read the Unix Haters Handbook? Anyone hate Unix? If you want a good laugh, go and search for it online. The Unix Haters Handbook. I come from the world of mainframes and multics, and I think Unix is a piece of shit. I mean, all these fucking 2-line commands, QR, PX. I mean, I understand why they did them, and I remember typing on a 300 baud modem and a 1275 where I could out-type the speed. But the idea that we're still running, and we say the same with developers who want to use short. Well, the thing I really dislike about Elixir is syntactic sugar to save a few comments. No, I don't want to use. I don't want. don't give me 3 versions of the same bloody thing. So yeah, so a lot of stuff that we've got is just we've got a legacy in Unix of crappy command names because typing was too slow in 1976. You know, we should try and fix some of that back then as well. It's too baked in.
Right. I'm 67, and yeah, it's quite disappointing how long it takes to sort of push out some of these bad ideas and, you know, get them out of the environment.
Well, you and I can have a little old man's chat about the good old days. So the DecVax had a file system where every time you saved a file, it incremented the version number, and every time you had to do a purge, it would get rid of the old ones. So you had a immutable write. And you're going, why doesn't Windows have that? Why doesn't the Mac have that? Why don't I have auto? You know, I've got terabytes of space on my disk. Terabytes, you know. I mean, I remember when I was a programmer on a computer with a mega RAM. It was only one in the UK, right? So there's all this stuff that we've solved these problems before. Why don't we just go back and do it properly, like what we used to do when we had punch cards, when Leo and I were at the cutting edge.
Cutting edge punch cards, I'll have you know.
Yeah, well,
but yeah, one of the things that Alan Kay says is, you know, nowadays we have all these resources, so much memory. Computers shouldn't ever delete anything because we don't need to anymore. There's no need to lose anything.
no.
So that's another example.
There's a tweet came past on Blue Sky the other week which I'm haunted with. It's this woman who's teaching people JavaScript, students, and says we have to start our course with explaining what a file system is, because the young people, she said, they live out their downloads folder like it's a van by the river. and you know, and another friend of mine who's a school teacher said to me, she said, we said to the kids, I will send you an email, 14-year-olds, and they said, what's an email? You know, they just use the phone, you know. And Google,
yeah, I had a conversation with my kids one day, and they didn't know the difference in size between a character, a short text message, and an image or a video. They all were kind of some amorphous size or other, but they didn't know how big they were. I was so disappointed.
Yeah, but there's no, you know, there's no, when you think about how much time it took to do anything, and how, I mean, I've done this research project with the Scottish government. I'm talking about how the state does computer systems, and one of my shticks was to talk about government computing in the 1980s. And I would say, you know, we built these systems to do national insurance, and they were major capital projects that and we had mainframes, and then I go, and that's the computer, right? That's my hearing aid. That's the kind of computer we used to use, right? And I've got another one here if you want, you know, if you need a backup. So the amount of
right, it goes twice as fast.
Yeah, the amount of computing power we've got is amazing. But and the purpose of it is to make it easier for developers to write more systems, right? And part of that, use me but don't understand me. That library stuff is part of that. We want people to assemble programs from pre-built components in a way, and then the challenge then is the component I'm using sensible, and what happens when there's some weird interaction. But actually, Elixir with the actor model, by and large, your problems are representable at the surface. If there's something wrong with that library, I will see it at the interface, but it won't actually poke into my world and smash it. So I understand why ExDoc is constructed the way it is, and why the Elixir ecosystem has exploded, and we have all these packages, and you know, why the community's grown so heavily. But at the same time, if you're an Erlang hand who's building, you know, big systems that you're working on 3, 4, 5, 7 years, then, you know, understanding what they do gets kind of important.